Hello, welcome back to History 321. I am Dr. Ron Traylor, and this is video number 10. Let me write that down before I forget. Okay, we are going to continue our discussion of free people of color. And that's where we were when we ended video number 9. All right, we said that there were a number of ways that a person could become a free person of color, and we'll return to that topic in just a moment. But it's let's pick up the thread of where we left off, and that was the fact that slave children, took on the condition of their mothers, not their fathers. Children who were born to a free person of color, a mama. If your mother was a free person of color, you were free, because the child always took on the condition of the mother. So let's play this game. You got a free mother and a slave daddy, and the free mother has a child. What's the condition of the child? Free. It doesn't matter if the father is free or slave. It doesn't enter into the equation. It's the condition of the mother that determines this. Now, in Louisiana, uh, we've mentioned these folks, but I need to give you a little bit more information on the free people of color who came from the island of Haiti as the result of the Haitian Revolution. Many of the people of Haiti, including free people of color, moved to the island of Cuba immediately after the Haitian Revolution. And they were welcomed by the Spanish in Cuba. But as the years go by, the relationship between Spain and France sours, and the Haitian free people of color are kicked out of Cuba. Now, it's not just them that are kicked out. The whites are kicked out too. If you're French, you're kicked out. As a result of that, and there are, once again, we'll never really know how many people are affected by being kicked out of Cuba. But I saw a thing just recently that said that it might be as many as 10,000 people. Okay, so those 10,000 people include whites, slaves, and free people of color. And the common denominator is that they're all French, right? And many of those people, what is the nearest French speaking place for these people from Cuba? It's Louisiana. The ownership of Louisiana might change, right? But the people don't, and many of the people of Louisiana still speak French. And so these outcasts from Haiti would feel very comfortable here in Louisiana, and they did move here. Maybe as many as 10,000. Now, there's another reason. So the point that I'm trying to make, and the point that I'm getting ready to abandon, the point is that a lot of free people of color come to Louisiana from Cuba, but they began their journey in Haiti. Haiti, Cuba, Louisiana. Another source of free people of color. Many wealthy whites keep black mistresses. And had children by them. Every relationship was somewhat different, but some of these relationships, there literally was a contract drawn up between the woman and the white man. Many of these women were of mixed race. Many of these women were only a quarter black or an eighth black or a 16th black. Some of these women were so, their complexion was so light that you really couldn't tell that they had any African in them. Well, not quite often, sometimes. Now, the woman was still a slave. And remember, please, the child takes on the condition of the mother. So any children born from this relationship, fundamentally the sexual relationship between the slave woman and the white man, is going to result in a slave child. But some masters, even during their own lifetimes, freed certain of their slaves who were born to their mixed race mistresses. As a matter of fact, sometimes the masters went as far as to treat their children, their mixed race children, the same as they treated their white children that they had by their wives. Would send them to school, would educate them, would prepare them for life. And here's another one that I haven't mentioned. Another way that you could become a free person of color. If a man bought his own freedom and he married a woman who had bought her own freedom. No. Let's do it this way. That's not a good example. Let's stop before I go any further. The man is free. The man is a free person of color, but his wife is still a slave. That's the scenario that I'm looking for. The man is free. He is a free person of color, but the wife is still enslaved. The children that he had with her are slaves, aren't they? Because the children take on the condition of the mother. It was not unheard of for the man, once he had purchased his own freedom, he would work for years and years and years after that to buy his wife's freedom. Or he would work for years and years and years after that to buy the freedom of his children. No matter how you became a free person of color, Louisiana had more of the free people of color than any other state. And most of them lived in the city of New Orleans. Now, there were small groups of free people of color scattered across the state. But by and large, the majority of free people of color lived in New Orleans. Free people of color became an urban population, if you will. They made a living by their own labor. They received all the fruits of their own labor. And they did all kinds of different things to earn a living. They became butlers, carriage drivers, stevedores. We talked about what the heck a stevedore was just a few minutes ago in the last lecture. Iron workers. Much of that, if you're familiar with the French Quarter, you are familiar with that beautiful wrought ironwork that is all over the French Quarter. Much of that wrought ironwork was done by free people of color. They became blacksmiths, cooks, nannies, seamstresses, prostitutes. Some of them actually owned their own land and they became farmers. I mentioned a few moments ago that some of the white men who fathered children with black slave women treated those children in a similar fashion to the way they treated their white offspring from their wife. It was not unheard of in Louisiana when a will was read that the dead man would not only leave land to his, I hate to use regular or legal, but you know what I'm talking about. He would leave his white children land, but he would also leave his black children land. As a matter of fact, um, some plantations in Louisiana were owned by free people of color. And oddly enough, I still have, after all these years, I know this is true, but it still just hasn't set right with me yet. It was not unheard of for a free person of color to actually own slaves themselves. Now, free people of color did not have all of the rights of citizenship, but they certainly had more rights of citizenship than slaves did. So let's sort of go down the list and figure out the rights that the free people of color had. And some of these are unique to Louisiana because what was legal for free people of color to do in Louisiana was not necessarily legal in other states. In Louisiana, a free person of color could sue a white man. In Louisiana, a free person of color could even testify against a white man. In Louisiana, free people of color could marry. Slaves could not sue a white man. Slaves could not testify against a white man. Slaves could not legally marry. And so, what happens if a slave man and a slave woman wanted to get married? Well, they would have an alternative ceremony. Quite often, it was known as jumping the broom. um, they would promise that they would be faithful to each other, and they would stand in the slave cabin door, and someone would hold a broom, and they would jump over the broom, and the little poem was jumping over the broom into marital bliss, right? Now, were they legally married? Absolutely not. Were in their own eyes, were they married? Yes, because they understood that slavery was an evil institution and that under normal circumstances, living together unmarried would be a sin. But they understood that the master was forcing them to live like that. And so they took lemons and made lemonade as best they could. The children of free people of color could inherit from their parents. And they had most, but not all, of the common law rights that whites had. Now, let me stop right here. We've mentioned this, I think, or did we? And just in case we didn't, let me tell you that unlike the other states, Louisiana operated under two legal systems, and still does, by the way. All the other 49 states of the Union operate under the common law, which is the English tradition of the law. Here in Louisiana, some of our laws are common law, such as the presumption of innocence until you're proven guilty, the right of habeas corpus, the idea that you cannot be held indefinitely unless you're charged with a crime, a trial by jury. All of those are common law things that generally deal with criminal law, right? And we have that in Louisiana. But we also have something else. In addition to that, we have the Napoleonic Code. In the years that we were French, in the years that we were a French colony before we were sold to the United States, Napoleon uh, reconstructed the French legal system. And we won't go into the details, but I will simply say that the result was something that we still call, it was called then, and we still call it the Napoleonic Code. And generally, the part of the Napoleonic Code that we kept in Louisiana was those laws that applied to family. The rules for getting married, that's in Louisiana. That's Napoleonic Code. The rules for getting divorced, that's Napoleonic Code. The rules for adopting a child, that's Napoleonic Code. So, the common law fundamentally is used for criminal cases. The Napoleonic Code in Louisiana is used for family related cases. So, the free people of color had many of those common law rights: presumption of innocence, habeas corpus, trial by jury. But they didn't have all the rights of the common law. They could not serve on juries. Now, what did we say? They could sue a white man, they could testify against a white man, but they still couldn't serve on a jury. Because a black man sitting in judgment of a white man was too much for white men to accept at this time. And when a free person of color goes on trial, they go on trial in front of an all white jury. Since they can't serve on juries, that means that no blacks serve on juries, which means that if they are tried, by necessity, their jury is going to be an all white jury. Free people of color were liable for unique crimes. For example, they could be arrested, they could be charged with a crime called disrespect to white people. Now, that could take different forms. I mean, who's to say what respect or a lack of respect is? Well, it's usually in the eye of the white guy. I mean, what if the free person of color is on the sidewalk and he meets a white guy, and the white guy refuses to yield the right of way, and the black guy refuses to yield the right of way? The black man, if he's a free person of color, can literally, if he's a slave, he can be whipped. But if he's a free person of color, he can be charged with disrespect. And by by Louisiana law, free people of color were always required to carry on their person documents that proved that they were free rather than slaves. And that was difficult, but nevertheless, that's what the law said. Now, as time passes in Louisiana, the Louisiana state legislature begins to pass laws that make manumission of slaves much more difficult. In the year 1840, for example, 25,000 Louisiana slaves were manumitted for various reasons. Doesn't matter what the reason was. 25,000 were manumitted. They're now free people of color. That's in 1840. By 1860, only 20 years later, only 18,000 were manumitted. So you can see, and of course, the black population is going up all the time. So um, that's a serious reduction in the number of blacks who are permitted to receive manumission. Okay, let's spend the rest of our lecture time today. Remember in the syllabus. Well, let me quote it. I like to quote myself to make sure that I'm right. Stand by. Forgive me. Course description. Okay, this is in your syllabus. This course is designed to provide a survey of Louisiana history from the age of discovery to the present. It includes units on colonial Louisiana, which we have completed, 19th century Louisiana, which we're in the middle of, and modern Louisiana, which we still have to do, and stresses in depth coverage of the roles of women, which we are doing, and minorities, which we are doing, particularly the influence of African Americans and Cajuns. And I think that we're doing a pretty good job with that so far. Okay. Many of you have learned things about African American history in Louisiana that you did not know. And that's the key, right? You've learned something. And that's my purpose too. Okay. Let's continue to talk about Black Louisianians, except this time let's move the focus away from the free people of color back to the enslaved people. I know we seem to be going back and forth, but there is a method to my madness. All right. Now, let's don't talk about slavery in Louisiana quite yet. Let's just talk about slavery in the Western Hemisphere, and then let's start narrowing it down to the United States. Okay. Let's begin. I want to begin by admitting to you that we have no idea how many Africans were kidnapped and enslaved and sent to the nations of the Western Hemisphere. We simply do not know. But an educated guess is that between the years 1460, and of course that's before Columbus, right? So we were stealing Africans from Africa long before Columbus ever sails to the Western Hemisphere. Between the years 1460 and the year 1870, the year 1870 is the year that Brazil became the last country in the Western Hemisphere to outlaw slavery. So between 1460 and 1870, the best guess is that 20 million Africans were kidnapped from Africa and taken against their will to various destinations. Now, when I say various destinations, I'm not saying that 20, you got to be careful. You got to understand what I'm saying and not what you think I'm saying. I'm not saying that 20 million Africans were kidnapped and sent to the Western Hemisphere. Not saying that at all. I'm saying that 20 million Africans were kidnapped and sent somewhere. And that somewhere includes the Western Hemisphere. It includes the Near East and also Western Europe. We sometimes lose track of the fact that some of these Africans actually went to Western Europe. Now, something that all of those 20 million people shared in common, no matter where they were going, was the brutality of the voyage from Africa that started in Africa and led to the Western Hemisphere or Western Europe or the Near East. There was a high death rate on those slave ships. Now, things got better as time passes, but it never got good. To show that it got better, let me give you some numbers. Now, once again, these are educated guesses by sociologists and anthropologists and archaeologists and historians and okay. In the 16th century, in other words, the 1500s, we think that the death rate aboard slave ships was between 15 and 20%. That's an appalling number. What I'm saying is that as many as 1/5 of all the slaves who got on the boat in Africa were dead and unable to get off the boat when they got to their destination. 15 to 20%. 1 out of 5. That's what 20% is. 1 out of 5. That was in the 16th century, the 1500s. Things got better because the ship captains began to realize that you had to try to take care of these people or they were going to die. And so conditions improved, not a lot, but conditions did improve in the 17th and 18th century, which is the 1800s and the 1900s. It was reduced from 15 to 20% from 10 to 15%. Still, a lot of people are dying in getting from Africa to wherever their ultimate destination is. Now, there were a number of reasons why the Africans were dying on board the slave ships. There was disease. Many of and remember, these were early on, they were European crews, right? And then later, it was a combination of European and Western Hemisphere crews. But many of the diseases that for the Europeans, for example, were minor diseases, things like measles and chickenpox. Many of those diseases were deadly for the Africans. They had never been exposed to any of those diseases, and they had not even a little bit of natural immunity. And so, let's say that a European crew member had chickenpox as a child and recovered from it. Well, he's still carrying that disease in his body, and he can transmit it to the Africans, and that's what happened. So disease quite often caused many deaths on board these ships. But the greatest cause, and of course, abuse, but the greatest cause of death on the slave ships wasn't even starvation, even though the food was atrocious. The biggest cause of death on the slave ships was dehydration. The Europeans, remember, this is a time when medicine is in its rudimentary stages. People don't really understand what causes people to get sick and what causes people to die. They don't understand that you can survive without food for a week or so. Now, you probably think you're going to die, right? So hungry, but you're not. You can use your body's fat reserves, but you cannot live without water for more than about 2.5 or 3 days. It doesn't matter how healthy you were before you got on that ship. If you're not given sufficient water to hydrate your body, you are going to die. And so, as best as we could figure, most of the deaths that took place on these slave ships was from dehydration, mostly to dehydration. Now, what we said was that as many as 20 million Africans between 1460 and 1870 left Africa. The majority of them headed for the New World. Once again, we can't put a number on it, but we are convinced by the rudimentary records that do exist that most of these 20 million their destination was the New World. And then when you subtract out those who went to Europe and those who went to the Middle East, who knows, maybe 17 million actually headed for the New World. Of those people, though, only about 10 to 15 million of them actually made it. the New World because the cross the Atlantic trip was so very deadly for so many reasons. Now, many of us, once again, let's go back to learning our history according to Hollywood. Many of us have been taught, we believe it with all of our souls, that most of the people, most of the Africans whose destination was the New World, their main destination was the United States or the areas that became the United States. Now, I can't see you, and so I can't ask you to give me a show of hands of you. How many of you were actually taught that? But if you were taught that, you know that is so wrong. That is so wrong. Of all of the Africans who were sent to the Western Hemisphere, who made it here, okay, about four, I'm going to give you some numbers. Ready? Here we go. About 42.2% of them were sent to the sugar islands of the Caribbean. Now, what the heck is a sugar island? Well, we've sort of touched on it in here. Some of the sugar islands, some of the more famous ones, were Jamaica and Barbados and Cuba and Puerto Rico. Those were all some of the more important of the sugar islands. Sugar Island is an island in the Caribbean whose main crop is sugarcane, from which sugar then can be made. 42.2%. Now, the next largest group went to Brazil. Brazil was a huge sugar producing nation. And until Brazil did away with slavery in 1870, I think I'm right about 1870, about 38.1% of all those Africans who left Africa and survived the trip, they went to Brazil. Now, an additional 5.5% went to other places in South America. Of course, Brazil is in South America. But 5.5% of the remaining slaves went to other places in South America. Argentina and Venezuela and Bolivia and Peru and Mexico. What was the percentage that went to the United States? It was only about 4.5%. So you see, those of you who were taught that most of those slaves went to the United States, whoever taught you that was wrong. And I would go as far as to say, without using any names, because I don't know the names of the people who taught you, but I would go as far as to say that if they didn't know what they were talking about with regard to slaves, maybe they didn't know what they were talking about on other issues as well. You might want to re-examine, you might want to reconsider everything that you know about history. If you were taught that little factoid that most of them came to the U.S. when they did not. About 2.1% of the slaves went to Mexico. I included Mexico, I'm sorry, a while ago when I was talking about the remainder of South America. So scratch Mexico from that and give Mexico a place of its very own. 2.1%. So you do the math. You add up all those numbers and you'll discover that 94.5% of all slaves that left Africa on these slave ships and survived the trip and finally got to the New World, 94.5% of all of them went to places other than what became the United States. Now, let's talk about slavery itself. We've talked about it in many ways. Let's talk about it in a different way. Slaves were not considered people. They were considered to be property. Um, some places considered them to be land, the same kind of property as land, what we call real property, right? Real estate, real property. Other places considered them to be chattel. Let me spell that one. Chattel. They were considered to be chattel property. Um, the grandfather clock in the parlor is it's property. It's not land, though, is it? And so it's considered to be chattel property. Slaves, because they were property of some kind, they could be used as collateral for loans. If the slave owner wanted to go to the bank and borrow money to spend on whatever, he could use the slave as collateral for the loans. Um, he could use the slave as a bet in a poker game. In Louisiana, and this sort of agrees with what I've already told you, I said that the average number of slaves living on the average farm across the South was 7. And in Louisiana, just Louisiana, that number was 10. So the average plantation in Louisiana, 10 slaves. Most of those slaves, and this won't surprise you because we've already talked about this, most Louisiana slaves lived and labored on plantations or at least on a large farm. Most slaves lived in the field. They were referred to as field hands. And both male and female slaves worked in the field. They're in the fields. Now, there was a division of labor according to your gender once you got back to the slave cabin. We've talked about that. But in the field, there was very little gender discrimination. There was some. Men did the really heavy work. For example, most of the guys who were plowmen, right? That's hard work. Most of the people who were the plowmen were males. And in Louisiana, on the sugarcane plantations, most, not all, but most of the men at harvest time who actually cut the cane with a machete, that's backbreaking work too. And most of them were men. But generally, women and men shared the labor as field hands. Now, some were specialists, though. So not all of the slaves were field hands. There were specialists. Some served were trained as blacksmiths. Um, uh, the larger plantations, the masters didn't have to go into town to get things like this done. They had enough slaves where they could specialize. They could have a slave or two who specialized in blacksmithing and doing all the things that blacksmiths do. How about barrel makers? That's a really specialized job. You've got to have some talent to create that barrel in such a way that it doesn't leak, right? Shoemakers. Um, and then, of course, there were the so-called uh, house slaves, the cooks, the butler, um, the nanny, the wet nurse. What the heck is a wet nurse? Well, it's usually a young slave woman who has just given birth, and as a result, her breasts are full of milk. If the mistress, if the white woman has given birth about the same time as the slave woman, in order to keep her figure, she will hand the white child over to the slave woman and have the slave woman nurse the white baby on one arm and the black baby on one arm and the white baby on the other. Wet nurse. That's what they were called. Some slaves were actually hired out by their masters um, to other people who needed extra labor. I mean, if I am a slave owner and I have more slaves than I need, in order to make a profit from them, what do? I look for somebody who will rent or lease that slave. Sure. Now, if you were an urban slave, your life was different. I'm not necessarily saying that it was easier. I'm saying it was different than if you were a rural slave. Because if you were a rural slave, the chances are likely that you're a field hand and your life can be brutal. But if you live in town, the chances are that you have an advantage over your country brothers because you're probably a carriage driver or a butler or something like that, right? And fundamentally, what that means is, and I hate to use the word freedom because there was no freedom as such, but you had more freedom if you lived in the city than you did if you lived in the countryside. Um, if you were a slave in New Orleans and you were a cook, it's very likely that your owner or your mistress, rather than doing the grocery shopping herself, will send you to the French market to get that day's food, the preparations for that day's food. Now, what that means is that if you wanted to, you could uh, waste a little time on your way to the market. You could waste a little time at the market while you were shopping. You could waste a little time. You don't want to waste a lot of time because you don't want to come to the attention of the mistress, but you can afford to waste a little bit of time, free time, time that's your own. And that type of time was really precious if you were a slave. There was nobody looking over your shoulder. There was nobody telling you what to do. As long as you did the job and you got home in time, nobody was going to say much to you. Now, we've already talked about how uh, slaves quite often kept slave gardens for their own use, to sell to the masters, to sell to others, to go into town to sell. And of course, we've said that it was from that gardens that a lot of the money that was used to buy, that the slaves used to buy themselves, was generated. Some slaves, now this was rare, but nevertheless, it happened. Some slaves were so trusted by their masters that they were pretty much permitted to run the plantation. Or if the master was an urban master and he owned a business in New Orleans or Baton Rouge or Opelousas, the slave probably knew as much or more about running the business than the master. And the slave was permitted to run it on the day-to-day basis. It was not common, but it did happen. Now, the U.S. Constitution was written in the year 1787 and it was ratified in the year 1788. And the Constitution had several things to say about slavery, none of which was good for the slave. That is my opinion. And a bajillion books have been written on this topic. Was the Constitution anti-slavery or was it pro-slavery? I come down on the side that says that it was pro-slavery. The Constitution was not a friend of the slave, but was a friend of the slave owner. Now, let me try to make my case. Now, the U.S. Constitution, as written in 1787, banned the Atlantic slave trade. And you say to yourself, oh, that's wonderful. And it is. You'd be right if you felt that. Oh, it's wonderful. But here's the problem, and here's the part that makes it pro-slavery. Every single word in the original Constitution of 1787 went into effect the moment that the Constitution was ratified, with one exception. What was that exception? The ban on the Atlantic slave trade. That sounds so wonderful. It's not so wonderful. The Constitution gave 20 years before the ban on the slave trade went into effect. Now, you ask yourself, I hope you're sitting there asking yourself, why? And my response is, and I will believe that this is true unless I'm proven to be wrong, I say that it was to give slave owners the chance to stock up on slaves before the ban went into effect. Why else is it that the ban on the Atlantic slave trade is the only part of the United States Constitution as written in 1787 that did not go into effect immediately? Okay, so that's one argument for the Constitution being a pro-slavery document. The second argument is the Constitution, as written in 1787, contained a fugitive slave portion. And what the Constitution, and this of course went into effect immediately, right? If you were a slave and you somehow successfully ran away from your master and you went to some other part, let's say that you were from Louisiana and you made your way to Massachusetts. Were you free forever? No, you were not free forever. You were free only as long as you could avoid being recaptured. But the Constitution of 1787 said that you could be chased, you could be caught, and you could be returned to slavery if you were caught. Now, years ago, I made the statement that nothing could be worse than slavery. And a colleague of mine very wisely said, "Oh, there's something that's worse than slavery." And I said, "Boy, I want to know what it is. I just can't imagine anything more terrible than slavery." He said, "Think about it. Let's assume that you had been a slave and that you successfully ran away to Massachusetts, and you lived there for 5 or 10 or 15 years as a free man. And all of a sudden, somebody shows up at your door and puts you in chains again and brings you back to Louisiana and re-enslaves you." He said, "I think that's worse than slavery." And I had to admit that he was right. The Constitution of 1787 also continued the idea that slaves were not citizens. In what we call the Great Compromise. Let me give you the background of the Great Compromise. Some of you have had History 201, some of you have not. And some of you have forgotten it, some of you never learned it. So let me give you a tutorial on the Great Compromise. Okay, here's the scenario. It takes place at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. And the question becomes, how are we going to determine representation in the United States House and in the United States Senate? Some people want it to be simply based on population in both chambers. The more people you have, the more senators you have, the more people you have, the more U.S. representatives you have. Well, that creates a built-in problem. That's fine if you're a state that has a lot of people. That means that you're going to get a lot of U.S. senators and a lot of U.S. representatives, right? But what if you're a low population state like little Rhode Island or Vermont or New Hampshire, for that matter? If your representation, if your voice in the Congress is going to be based on your state's population, what that means is high population states are always going to be able to lord it over you. And some of the small states, when I say small, what I really mean is low population. Okay. Many of the low population, some of the low population states began to let it be known that if they are going to base representation on their population, that they're going to withdraw from the Constitutional Convention and go home and never become a part of the United States. Now, I'm simplifying the story considerably, but I'm giving you the important parts. When it became obvious to the high population state representatives that these low population state representatives were serious about abandoning the Constitutional Convention, they reached out and created a compromise. This compromise is called the Great Compromise. It was crafted by a man by the name of Roger Sherman from the state of Connecticut, who forevermore, as long as the United States will last, the history books will always refer to him as the Great Compromiser. What Sherman says is, let's do this. Let's make representation in the U.S. Senate based on equality. Every state, no matter how many people it has or how few it has, every state will have the same number of U.S. senators. Now, that made the low population states very happy, didn't it? Because now little low population Vermont had the exact same number of U.S. senators as high population Virginia or Massachusetts. But the other part of the compromise said that in the U.S. House of Representatives, the more people you have, the more representatives you will have. And that made the high population states happy. So, and that's what a compromise is, isn't it? What is a compromise? You give a little, you take a little, and you meet somewhere in the middle. You don't get all that you want, but you don't give up everything too. Everybody walks away from the table with something. And that's what happens with the Great Compromise. And so the Constitutional Convention was saved by Roger Sherman and the Great Compromise. But the debate was not over. The debate, okay, now, let's turn our attention to the House of Representatives. Remember what the Great Compromise said. It said, in the House of Representatives, the more people you have, the more U.S. representatives you're going to have. Well, southern states, and we've already decided, haven't we, that by 1787, that many of the southern states were well on their way to having a 50-50 white-black ratio. And in South Carolina already had a black majority population. So the slave states began to ask the question, a fundamental, legitimate question, who are we going to count? We're going to count everybody. Are we? Are we going to count everybody? Or are we going to count just free people? Or are we going to count the slaves also? And there's a reason that they ask this question. If they count the slaves, that means that their population, remember, the population is 50-50 pretty much. And if they count only the whites, their population is going to be half of what it would be if they counted slaves. And what that means is if they count the slaves, they're going to have a lot more representatives in the Congress from their state. But other delegates to the Constitutional Convention said, whoa, time out. That's not right. You claim that these slaves are not even people. You claim that they're property. And yet at the same time, you're claiming that we should count them as Americans with regard to how many representatives our states are going to have. They said you can't have it both ways. The southern states realized that the northern states were sort of right, but they were not willing to give up the argument, and so they debated it for quite a while, for quite a bit, and another compromise was created. And the compromise was this: that in every state of the union, when the census was conducted, that everybody would be counted. Okay, let me say that again. Everybody, every man, woman, and child, no matter what their race, except the Indians, by the way. They didn't have the courage to go out into the woods to the Indian villages and count the Indians because they knew that they might not survive the trip. But except for the Indians, every American, man, woman, and child is going to be counted. Now, once everything is counted, all the white people are going to be considered whole people. But the slaves are only going to be counted as 3/5 of a person. Now, I mentioned this here a while back when we were talking about the the Louisiana Constitution. But let me say it again. The problem becomes, we've already counted them. Now, are we going to count them as whole people, or are we going to count them as part of a person? Because if we count them as a whole person, that very well might lead to the full rights of citizenship for the slave. And so a further compromise was reached. And once it was figured out how many slaves each state had, let's keep the math simple. Let's assume that Louisiana had 100,000 slaves. Okay, at that point, you know exactly how many slaves each state has. Louisiana has 100,000. You will use the 3/5 rule to determine how many of those will be used for representational purposes. And the number is 3/5. The fraction is 3/5, which is 60%. So in Louisiana, the formula is count them all, but only use 60% of that number to determine how many more representatives Louisiana will have in the United States Congress. Instead of having 100, they would have 60. And each state was done like that. All right. I know we're a few minutes early, but my wife just stuck her head in the library door to inform me that dinner is ready. So I'm going to stop a few seconds early, and we will pick up later with lecture number 11.